Hey, konnichiwa YouTube, Bill Faulkner with Faulkner Custom Rods here, and finally tackling the series you've all been asking for over and over. I get more requests for this topic than anything else, and that is applying finish. So, complicated topic, important topic, so I'm going to do a series of 3 videos. The first, which we're doing today, is going to be about how I apply guide wrap finish. I'm also going to do a second video about how to apply butt wrap finish, and then finally wrap it up with a video on common finish problems and how to fix them and sort of tips and tricks. So it's really interesting. I get probably 10 times more requests for videos about finish than anything else. And when I'm with customers or other builders and we're looking at my rods, I get more people asking, how do you apply your finish than anything else? And so it's a complicated topic, it's an involved topic, but we're going to try to dive into it. I think one of the really important things about finish is it's one of the most accessible ways for a non-builder to assess the quality of a custom rod or a rod builder's skill. And I guess the example I'd give you is, I've never painted a car in my life, but I can look at a car and immediately tell if it has a poor paint job. If there's bubbles in it, if it's lumps and imperfections, if it's not high gloss. Finish is the same way. You do not have to be a rod builder or even an angler to look at a rod, and if it's got a poor finish job, it jumps out at you. The other thing about finish is it's the final step in the process, right? So it doesn't matter how effectively you selected components, shaped your guide feet, set up and designed a rod, selected the blank, your guide train, everything else is moot if you fail at the finish line, literally, no pun intended. So you really need to master your finish, regardless of whether your builds are very elaborate and involved or whether they're very sort of stripped down and traditional and basic, because a poor finish job just sort of indicates poor quality of the entire build, whether that's actually true or not. The other thing that makes me a little nervous when we get into finish and some of the aesthetic things is this is highly subjective, right? So there's more than one way to do anything. You hear me say that every time. And what's perfect to my eye might not even look that good to your eye, and that's okay. But I think ultimately what we're talking about is, as individual builders, we want to master our techniques such that we can develop consistency. So what I'm after, whether what I think is a perfect guide foot finish is perfect to you, if you walked into my shop and looked at 50 rods, they all look the same. Okay, the double foot guide finishes look the same, the single foot guide finishes look the same. And so that's what I think we're after. So I have no interest in sort of arguing about what's too heavy or too light or how far we should overlap onto the blank or any of that. I want us to really focus on mastery, and that mastery is exhibited and sort of demonstrated through consistency. So when you can get the finish to come out the same way every single time, guide after guide, rod after rod, you've mastered it. Whether you've mastered the look I like or not, totally up to you. But I want to help you focus on how you can develop that consistency and mastery. And I'll show you what I think mastery looks like and what looks good to me. So a couple of key things, I'd say key things to doing it my way, but I think these are key things to doing it anyway. And one is, you gotta be absolutely consistent. If you want a predictable result, you need to do everything exactly the same way every time, right? So that means you're going to measure and mix exactly the same every time. You're going to apply exactly the same way every single time. And you're gonna go to the length of managing the conditions in your shop. I have a small space heater, and I keep my temperature and humidity very consistent. It's about 74 to 76 degrees at all times. Those things matter, right? So focus on repetition and consistency. You can't be constantly changing variables and expecting it to come out the same way. The other thing about even guide foot finish, in my experience, regardless of what product you're using, you've got to be willing to use at least 2 coats. And so I have conversations with people that say, man, this is awesome. How do you get this guide foot finish? I say, oh, well, the first coat, I know, 2 coats, man, that's a lot of trouble. You don't want perfect finish very much. If you're not even willing to do 2 coats after all the work you've put into the rod, then I can't help you, right? But in my experience, regardless of product, there's no way to get a perfect finish without using at least 2 coats. The only time that I don't use 2 coats is when I use 3 or more coats on really big or heavy rods. So just close your mind to the fact that you need to use 2 coats. And then, you know, I think the only other thing is I use heat, the application of heat in my finish process, both for guide wraps and for butt wraps, and we should just get some disclaimers out there. Heat can be dangerous. It can burn and hurt you. It can ruin your blank. It can ruin your finish. I'm using very little heat, applied very gently, in a very consistent way. But full disclosure, in about 1997, I completely melted the tip section of a Loomis NLX fly blank, and it nearly killed me because that was a $500 blank at the time, and I ruined it, and it was my fault. Now, they were gracious and they let me replace it at a reasonable cost, but you can use too much heat and ruin things. You can burn down your house, you can scorch your finish. So you can also use these same techniques and principles without heat, and it's almost what I showed in this video, but I don't want to be insincere and I don't want to be accused of sort of teaching you one thing when I'm actually doing something else. So I am not responsible or have any liability for anything that goes wrong for you trying these techniques and using heat or anything else. So you need to use common sense and you need to be very careful, and I'm sure you can. So with that, let's dive in. All right, so what is perfect guide finish? So to me, it's complete even coverage of the thread wraps with no thread poking through, no fuzzies or imperfections. I think you want even coverage off of the thread onto the end of the blank with very consistent and even overlap on both edges and from guide to guide. We obviously want no bubbles in the finish, especially next to the guide foot or in the tunnel. Even though we want the thread completely coated and encapsulated, we don't want it too bulbous or football shaped, and you don't want too much run out under the guide foot. To me, both of those look sloppy. And then to me, you also want the finish to be proportionate in diameter. So if it's a very thin tip section of a blank, then we want a pretty light coat. And if it's a big beefy guide and a thicker, near the butt section, I think it's okay for it to be a much thicker finish and much heavier. And then, you just want absolute consistency from guide to guide, each guide on the same rod and from rod to rod, so that you just are doing it the same way, getting the same result every single time. All right, so what are we going to need? First, you're going to need a high quality finish. And I've tried them all, I've used them all. The only things that I will use are Flex Coat products or the new Gen 4 from Access Outdoors, which is outstanding. This technique works with Gen 4. It works with Flex Coat SCS, Ultra V, or High Build. Probably work with Light Build, I just haven't tried it. You're also going to need some mixing cups. These are 1 ounce, and some syringes to measure the epoxy with. Free syringes come with every bottle of G4 you buy, which is pretty nice. Flex Coat also sells them, and you can find them at most of the rod building supply houses. And then finally, we're going to use a spatula to both mix the finish and apply it with. And so this is a flat dental cement spatula. I'll put a link to where you can buy some down below. But I prefer the ones with an octagonal handle so they don't roll off your bench, and I prefer the ones with the stiff rather than the thin blade. In terms of thread for the rod that you're going to see me demonstrate on, we're using Hytina ST Wrap nylon size A in color number 323, which is a violet, a real vibrant purple. And then for trim and accents, I'm using Hytina Aurora Metallic in size A in color 1414, which is purple. But the Aurora is a color change thread, and this thread flips between sort of a purple color and a teal blue color. And then for guides on this one, we're using Fuji Alkanites in the corrosion control CC finish. These are CCLKWAG 16 through 8s, very short footprint, high performance guide, and then size CCLDB 6 heavy duty single foot micros, and finishing with a CCMNAT 6 tip top, which is my preferred configuration for slow pitch jigging rods. All right, so I talk about the consistency. I'm going to show you by my watch exactly how I measure my finish. So what we have here is 3 parts, 3 cc's of part A and part B of Gen 4 finish from Axis Outdoor Products. And so I've measured it out in my syringes, I've put it in my cup, I have started my stopwatch, and now I am just mixing it. You need to adjust the speed you're mixing so you can go as fast as you want as long as you're not introducing bubbles. The bubble release is so good on Gen 4. You can see I'm mixing pretty quickly here. I go more slowly with the FlexScope products, but you're going to get it thoroughly mixed either way. Just try not to introduce any more bubbles than you have to. This is subtle, but you also see that I've sort of cupped the mixing cup in my left hand. My hands tend to be pretty warm, and I find that holding it, rather than just holding it with 2 fingertips, putting it in the palm of my hand and cupping it that way sort of warms the finish and makes mixing easier. So if you can see, I'm still getting streaks, but I'm just going to be mixing this, and I'm mixing in a counterclockwise direction because I'm right-handed. This is the way I mix every single time. And I'm going to mix for about a minute and 15 to a minute and 30 seconds. And I'm not going by time so much as I'm watching to see when streaks disappear. So it's about a minute and 17 seconds. My streaks are mostly gone. I'm still just seeing a few. And as soon as I don't see any more streaks, I'm going to start scraping the side of the cup. And it took about a minute and 21 seconds there. So now I'm just holding this spatula stationary against the edge of the mixing cup and rotating it. This helps make sure I scrape the bottoms and the corners. And my cup has 2 little corners, kind of the bottom corner and then a ridge above it. And I'm making sure I put the tip of the spatula in both of those. And you'll see new swirls start to form. You'll see kind of you can see that only took about 20 seconds or a little less. And now I go back to mixing in the palm. So I'm just going back and forth, mixing between stirring upright like this, as well as scraping the sides of the cup. And I literally follow this procedure in these times every single batch of finish I mix. So mix upright for about a minute, 20, minute and a half till you don't see swirls anymore. Scrape the sides of the cup. Again, I've mixed for, what is that, about 30, 40 more seconds. Now I'm going back to scraping the sides, making sure there's not any part unmixed. And again, the spatula stays stationary against the edge of the cup, and I'm just rotating the mixing cup to agitate or mix the finish. And once I get to this point, I'm about 2.5 minutes, I'm going to scrape the spatula to get anything that was stuck on the spatula the whole time, stick the spatula back in the finish, wait a second for the finish to kind of climb up so I don't start streaking bubbles through it, and I'm going to mix vertically again. And so I'm going to continue to do this, and at this point I'm not seeing any more streaks or swirls. I'm pretty much done. I'm just going to keep mixing till about 3 minutes or a few seconds over. Scrape the spatula, and we're done. All right, so now we're going to start applying the finish. And a couple of things. I'm going to start applying finish pretty heavily from the tip of the guide foot. You want to work from the outside edge of the guide foot in toward the guide ring. And what this does is force bubbles out of the guide foot tunnel and sort of help you saturate the entire wrap. At this point, I'm putting on a lot of finish, pretty heavy, but I'm putting it only on the thread wraps. I'm not overlapping off onto the blank at all with this first coat. I'm going to try to show this from a couple of different angles, but I think the keys are, don't be afraid to load up the spatula pretty heavy, and then I'm keeping the spatula pretty vertical. And by keeping my right hand and the spatula pretty still and rotating the rod under it, I'm able to have a lot of control with exactly where I put the finish. In terms of pressure, and again, you see I'm going to start on the outside edge away from the guide ring and work towards the center. So I'll start on the outside edges and work towards the ring, which means you start on the left for this side of the guide, and for the tipmost side of the guide, you're starting on the far right. But you're just going to kind of adjust on each guide to make sure you work from tip of the guide foot in towards the ring. In terms of the pressure I'm applying, this is like less pressure than you need to make a ballpoint pen work. You'd make a very light pencil line. So I'm really just touching it. I'm not, messing with the burnishing of the thread or packing or moving threads at all.
just very gently floating over the thread and applying a coat of finish. And again, this coat's heavy, but we have the thread is not saturated. The guide foot tunnels are not saturated. There's been no run out under the guide feet. And so, you know, it's okay to have it heavier than you think you need, right? We're going to go back and remove excess. And that's essentially the key to this technique. Thoroughly coat and flood the guide wraps, not onto the blank, but just the guide wraps, and rotate it for a while, let it saturate, let it flood the coat, and then we're going to go back and warm it gently and remove excess. So pretty much you see I'm doing the same thing over and over. Holding the spatula still in a nearly vertical position with your hand sort of gently resting on the rod blank gives you a lot of control. You just have to spin the rod under you, and you can very easily you know, keep the thread right, the finish right where you want it, which in this case is on the thread wraps only, not onto the finish. And so the only thing that I'd probably note is I'm moving pretty quickly. I'm not trying to. I've just done this so many times. I have a lot of familiarity with it. You'll probably move a lot more slowly at first, and that's okay. And you'll kind of learn the limits of how fast you can go and stay under control versus when you get too fast and things start flying away on you, you start coating out onto the rod blank. And so it's nice to have a couple of little pieces of paper towel here and some rubbing alcohol. So here I've accidentally gone out onto the blank, and that's fine. I'm just going to wipe it off. It's not a big deal as long as I have those paper towel squares ready. So have some paper towels cut up into, I don't know, 1-inch squares or so, about the size of gun cleaning patches for a center fire rifle. And some rubbing alcohol like we've talked about before, ready at hand, and you can just, you see I cleaned up that spot where I accidentally went off onto the blank. The reason I want to do that is it's going to impact how I'm able to edge and get overlap onto the guide, onto the blank in the next coat of finish. So on one hand, you know, is it a little perfectionist? Yes, but it impacts how straight an edge we get. Another thing you may notice, I'm kind of constantly rotating the rod. Remember that you have applied finish pretty heavily. It does run and sag and flow. And so if you stop for too long, then the finish that you have already applied further towards the butt, which as we're watching this video is to the left of the rod, may sag and run off or drip onto your lathe if you're not careful. So regardless of whether you're applying finish or not, or you're grabbing your paper towel, or repositioning your rod, be mindful to continue to rotate the rod every so often and don't let it sag so much that it's going to drip off. And so here we've moved from our size 16, then 12, then 10, then 8 double foot guides, and now we're on our first size 6 CCLDB guide. And it's really the same thing. Just make sure you thoroughly coat all of the thread with plenty of finish, but don't go over onto the guide foot too much. Don't go over onto the blank too much. And this is really all there is to it for this first coat. And I'll show you the remainder of the guides. It makes for a bit of a long video, but hopefully it will be abundantly clear for you. And I'm just going to continue this process up the rod until I've completed all of my single foot guides. When we've completed that, we're going to let it rotate for a while, just for a couple of minutes, and we're going to go back and start applying some heat and removing the excess. All right, now here's where we diverge from the typical a little bit, and we're going to start applying some heat. So all I'm doing here is very gently, and you can't see, I'm going to change the camera angle for the next part so you can see it, but I'm putting very little heat from a constantly moving Bic lighter directly under this guide. And it doesn't take much heat, and it's going to begin to run and sag, and I'm just going to grab the excess off the top of the guide foot and then remove everything that will sag. So here we go again, another guide, same thing. I'm just gonna, and it looks like the lighter's not quite under the guide because of the parallax of the camera, but it is. Keeping the cigarette lighter constantly moving several inches beneath the rod. You see me put my finger over it to feel the heat and make sure I'm not getting it too hot. As soon as it starts running, and you'll see bubbles come out, you'll see it start to sag, just take a little bit off the top of that single foot, and then remove the excess that sags, and there you go. And I'm left with just enough finish to completely saturate the wrap, fill in the guide foot tunnels, and nothing extra. And that's all we need for our first coat. And so all I'm doing here is just working my way down the rod, gently warming each finish, the finish on each guide, very gently till I see it begin to run and sag. And then I like to rest with the guides up when I let it sag to remove the excess, because it helps bubbles release. If you stop with the guide down, it doesn't help the bubbles get loose that are trapped beside the guide foot. And so, again, just warming gently, rotating the rod. And I've seen a spot that I've sort of missed here where I didn't get some finish in on that safety locking wrap behind the guide foot. So I'm just touching it up a little bit, no problem. If you see things as you go, just correct them. Again, back to the cigarette lighter, constantly moving, never sitting still, and it's several inches beneath the blank. You can't tell that from here. But just warm it up while rotating until it starts to sag. Stop with the guide up, remove the excess, and then immediately flip it 180 degrees down and let it rest for a second. It'll sort of even out. And so that's really the process with coat one. That's all we're doing is now we're into the double foot guides, and we're going to do the same process, and we'll do it one side at a time. Just be mindful that the second side will get a little bit of heat from the heat you apply to the first side, so you won't have to use as much heat for in this side. I'm heating the double frame or double leg side of the guide first, and so the single foot side of the double foot guide, which is to the right here towards the tip, is going to require less heat because it already got a little with the other one. So again, rotate it, warm it gently. Once it's flowing and sagging, I'm going to stop with the guide foot up. I'm going to remove all the excess that will sag by touching the spatula to it, and then I'm going to flip it 180 degrees so the guide foot is down. And we're just going to continue that for all the guides. And once you've done that for every guide, go back and look at them, make sure they look okay, you don't have any bubbles or dry spots or problems. Then we're going to put it on a drying motor, and you see we're about 24 minutes in on the clock from starting to finish. And you're generally pretty good there. At 74 to 76 degrees, most of these finishes are going to start to get thick and slow down on you around 25 to 28 minutes. And they're going to start to be pretty unworkable, usually around 40 minutes. So you don't have to be in a big hurry, but you do need to sort of not waste time and keep moving. And so we'll wrap up this guide, and then we will go to the second coat from here. Now, change the camera angle here. Hopefully this is going to be helpful. All I'm doing now is I've let the first coat dry for 12 to 24 hours, and now I'm just inspecting, and I'm just looking at the wraps, right? And you can see we got a really good, even coat of finish. It looks pretty good right now. It just doesn't overlap onto the blank. We've got no bubbles beside our guide feet, and I'm just checking for fuzzies. And if I've got any fuzzies, I'm going to use a clean, sharp razor blade to cut them off. But just a little bit of inspection here to make sure everything looks good. Can save you a lot of heartache down the road, because this is one of the benefits of two coats. Now is a great time to fix any problems. If you got any fuzzies, any stick-ups, anything like that, you can trim them off right now with the razor blade, and you're good to go. All right, now we come to the controversial step. So now I'm applying my second coat, and what I've done is mix a coat exactly like we mixed the first coat, and then I've let it sit for 16 to 18 minutes. And you can see it's thick. It's the consistency maybe of pancake syrup or honey. And that's what I want. And so I'm gonna, after letting it sit for 16 to 18 minutes in a 74 to 76 degree shop, to when it starts to get thick, I'm gonna go back and apply the second coat. And again, like the first coat, I'm applying it very heavy to the thread wraps only. And I'm gonna do that for every single guide, starting at the butt and working to the tip. So again, you got to just grab a big sloppy globule of finish, put it on, And you're not trying to get it too perfect. Just make sure you got pretty heavy coverage all the way around the thread wraps. You know, this step of allowing the thread to set for a while before you apply it. I started doing this because what was happening with my second coat was I would mix it and immediately apply it, and it would look perfect. Then I would put it on the rod dryer, the turner, and come back and check it 2 hours later, and it wouldn't look good. It would have flowed and moved and run, and had run out too far under the guide feet. And where I had good coverage onto the blank and the threads were covered, the very edges of the wrap were poking through, and I was just having trouble where the finish was kind of moving on me. And so I developed this technique. I kind of call it freeze frame finishing, but essentially by letting the finish set for a while before you apply it, you're deliberately sort of limiting the pot life. And then here in a minute, we're going to warm it a couple of times, and that's going to ultimately force it to set up. So it's going to immediately set and stay the way we want it to stay. So the right thickness, the right amount of run out under the guide foot, and no thread edges showing or anything like that. So again, this takes some getting used to, but it's really pretty simple. Once you're comfortable with the spatula, you're just taking a heavy glob of finish, and while holding the spatula still and vertical to the relative to the rod blank, you're just slobbering on a big fat coat of finish onto the guide wrap only, not the rod blank. And you don't really need to worry about how it looks right now. You just need to get really complete coverage with no dry spots, and you want a pretty fat, bulbous, you know, football-looking coat of finish. And I'm moving my rod support so you can see better, so it's not in the frame the whole time. Probably should have done that sooner. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out these camera angles for you guys so you can see what I'm doing. All right, so now we're going to start warming it. So with each side, and you can see the lighter is a good 4 inches below, say, the rod blank. I warm the finish to it just starts to flow. The second it starts to sort of look liquid and flow and you see it thin out, now I'm going to edge my wrap. And again, I'm holding the spatula completely vertical, and I'm holding it right against the edge of the wrap on the blank. And by using this thick finish that I've just very gently warmed, it's going to help me. You'll see it just wants to keep a straight line and a consistent edge, and I get a perfect even edge. Now I'm going to warm it for the second time, and this time this is the warmest I ever get it. I'm going to warm it until it's really flowing, and you can see the other guide I'm not working on is flowing really well. And once I've got it good and warm, I'm going to remove, I'm about to have a drip off the one I'm not working on. I'm going to remove all the excess, flip it 180, and that's it. That finish is going to freeze, and it's going to stay just like that. Now, I don't have to, since I've already warmed the second guide, the second side of this guide, I'm going straight to the edging of it. And again, I'm just holding the spatula very vertical against the edge of the thread wrap, which is very clean from the first coat of finish, and I'm just rotating the rod with the spatula loaded from finish I've already put on the wrap. And what that gets me is a very consistent thickness and straight line edge all around the blank. Now I'm just, again, warming it till it's just going to start to flow and sag a little bit. You can see it sagging there, that's it. And then guide up, let it sag as much as it will. And it looks like I may have got a little bit of finish on my hand here, so I'm going to wipe it off. Once it's sagged all it's going to sag, I'm going to remove everything that'll come off. I'll even touch the other side again. Now flip it 180. Yeah, it looks like I got a little bit of finish on my finger and touch the rod blank, so just clean it up. It's not a big deal. And there you have it. Now, by virtue of letting the finish set for 16 or 18 minutes before I started, applying it and then warming it, you see it's not moving, it's not sagging, it's not changing, it's sort of frozen just like that, and that's how it's going to look once it sets. So again, here we go. We're going to warm, and again, very gently on the warming here. As soon as you see it start to sag or run even a little there, you just see, then you go to do your edging. And I always start with the edge away from the guide foot first, and you see I'm going pretty slow, but as long as you got finish. This is kind of a hard thing to explain, but when you try it, this finish is really thick and almost kind of coagulated at this point, and it wants to stay together, and it won't wander out and make it hard to get a straight edge like it does when it's really thin and hasn't set for a while. It just, if you try it, you'll see what I mean. It's very, very easy to get a straight edge, a finish all the way around the guide blank. I'm sorry, the rod blank, and that's what we're after. So now I go to warm it a second time, and this time I'm getting it pretty warm. I don't want it to just barely flow like I did at first. I want it to flow pretty well, get pretty liquid, and then once I've got it like that, again, stop it with the guide foot up, let everything that'll sag and come off sag, and then I'm just going to lift it off the bottom with the spatula. For small single foot guides, you need to be a little careful that your spatula may be thicker than your guide wrap is long, and so you don't want to splatter or finish or mash it against the rod blank, so be a little mindful of that. But this technique works really, really well. And you can see I didn't begin to warm the second part of this 2-foot guide wrap because it was already sort of flowing a little bit from the heat applied to the first side, and so that's fine. We're just going to get it barely flowing. We're going to edge the guide foot side and then the guide ring side, and then we're going to warm it to get it. And this is the part where you got to be careful. You shouldn't smell. It looks like I got the line not quite straight, so I'm going to go back and clean it up a little bit there. And again, it's very easy to clean up and keep consistent because it's sticking to itself and it's not as thin. It's got much higher viscosity. You should not smell the finish. If you begin to smell the finish or smell something that smells like finish burning, stop. You're using too much heat. And again, the lighter's constantly moving and the lighter's not that close. We'll let it sag as much as it will again here. Remove the excess. And really, that's all there is to it. Once you finish doing this for all the guides, you're going to put it on I like a 6 RPM turner and let it rotate until it's set.
All right, so there you have it. That's the FCR way of applying guide foot finish. Hopefully that was helpful. I know it's a little bit different, but if you give it a chance, I think you'll like it. A couple of things. If you have not already subscribed to Rod Maker Magazine, you need to do so. It is amazing. But specifically as it relates to this issue, if you look at volume 18, issue 1, there's an article in here called Freeze Frame Finishing, where this exact technique is described in a lot more detail than I could go into in the video. And so if you want to really perfect this technique, I would highly encourage that you subscribe to Rod Maker, and you can find, or if you just want to order the back issue, volume 18, issue 1, you can find a lot more detail than even I was able to go into in the video. You can run out of time with this finish by virtue of letting it sit on the second coat for a while and then applying heat. You're done around 40, 42, 44 minutes, typically at 74 to 76 degrees. So if you have a really long really long rod with a lot of double foot guides, break it up into 2 coats. Do half of it in the second coat, and then do a second coat for the remainder of the guides or whatever. If you somehow have trouble and you're moving slowly and the finish starts to lock up on you and it's not cooperating, just stop, back off, and do another coat, right? I typically can do about 14 to 16 wraps in 1 coat, so that would be 8 double foot guides or 16 single foot guides. Just kind of depends. Usually it's a combination of both on most rods. So just kind of plan your work, and it's okay to go slow. It's okay to not get the entire rod done in that second coat round with 1 batch. You can do multiple batches if you need to. So hopefully this helps. Appreciate you watching. Please like and subscribe, and stay tuned. Next week, hopefully the same day, I'll drop the next video, and that's exactly how I apply butt wrap finish. So until then, tight lines, stay safe. Thanks for watching.